So I actually ran and wrote the technical interview for our office for several years. Why Morgan Stanley? I want to hear, listen, from all the people I've talked to, the culture at Morgan Stanley seems like a culture I want to be at. Why? Because you guys tend to work with thinner headcount, which means more responsibility. Promote from within. There's a lot of people that have been at Morgan Stanley 20, 25 years versus some of the other banks that went through a lot of transition during 09, 10, 11. And so those type of answers mean, wow, you've really spent the time to do the research and talk to the people to understand what differentiates us. And tell me about yourself, that one, what I want to know is, have you made thoughtful decisions about where you've ended up? I just want to know that you have a thoughtful, proactive approach to how your career is taking shape. It's just understanding that you have taken ownership of your own career and where you want to be, and you have a good sense of knowing why you want to be there, because ultimately you will last longer and be more resilient in the stressful times that can be a banking career. So I will say I've gotten broad spectrum. So I've worked on IPOs, obviously buy sides. I've worked on sell sides. We sold consolidated container domain capital. I've worked on spin-offs, split-offs, corporate hostile bids. I've worked on proxy fights with P&G. I've worked on cross-border transactions, so Mars acquiring Tasty Bite, which is an Indian company. So it's really been a really broad experience over my career. And there were years where I was a top performer, and there was years where I was kind of number two. And at first you're like, oh, why am I not top? But then you realize that you're only in so much control. If you do the best you can on every deal you have, you still might not be number one, because your peer next to you might have worked on a very, very high profile deal that incorporated a lot of very senior vice chairman and other bankers. Go in with that mentality and say, I'm here to learn. I'm here to develop relationships with this firm. I'm here to make myself a better banker over time. That should be your focus, and the results will play themselves out.
They kind of have what will be termed a bake-off, but basically you and other banking teams who have been invited from other firms will all go in, usually over the course of 1 day or 2 days, and meet with the team on the client side, the company side, that is in charge of the process. And those folks will basically hear you out. You'll have an active dialogue with them. You'll present your materials, and at the conclusion of that, they will determine who they felt would best, meet their needs, who they felt best understood the company and the market and the dynamics, who knew the right buyers, and who gave them comfort that they were kind of the right people to hold their hand and walk through the process with. I can't overstate how important the fit portion of interviews is. And so I would highly recommend that you spend a lot of time on that. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time preparing for technicals, which are important, but I personally believe that ultimately technicals are kind of check the box. The person knew the answers, did their homework, did the studying, while fit interviews ultimately make the decision. So that's probably one of the hardest questions, I think, that exist out there. The good news is you can spend a lot of time preparing for that before you ever go into the interview. And if you're watching this, it means you've already started to think about these things. Some people will tell you, oh, give a weakness that isn't really weakness, but really it's a strength. I personally would advise you not to do that. Some people will tell you just go and be honest, and everyone's flawed and you should give whatever your biggest weaknesses are. I would tell you not to do that. I think there are risks and challenges to both. So what I recommend is trying to find and spend a lot of time doing this. And I would find maybe 4 or 5 of them, or think about as many as you can ahead of time, because some people may say, tell me your greatest weakness. Some people may say, tell me your 3 greatest weaknesses. And so you want to have thought through this. But try to pick weaknesses that are true, they're real, but to some degree they're out of your control, A. And B, you're doing everything you can, and you have been, and you have a plan to continue to address that weakness. But I think there are weaknesses that you probably have that anyone in your shoes would have. One of the ones I used when I was in college was I came from liberal arts. I went to Columbia. I didn't have business kind of background or classes. And so, that was truly a weakness coming in versus the person who went to Wharton or wherever and had that business degree. but it was kind of to some degree out of my control outside of where, I chose to go to college. And I talked about the ways I was working to try to address that. Look, ultimately, the goal of M&A is a way to help a company achieve its strategy, whatever that may be. And so a company may be looking to enter a new market, a company may be looking to increase sales in a specific product or get a new product offering, acquire a new client base, or simply just get to a greater scale to be able to invest more in technology and marketing and save costs on redundancies. And depending on your client's objectives, the nature ultimately of the M&A and how you model it could be a bit different. But more or less, it's taking two companies that each exist and putting them together. So A plus B. It is a bit that simple. And then you make some adjustments to that. So A plus B may not operate the same way as A and B independently operated. The most obvious things that happen are either what are called revenue synergies or expense synergies. So when you think about the model, that's basically what it is. It's saying I have a company A that looks like this, go forward. I have a company B that looks like that, go forward. A plus B equals A plus B, go forward, and then make the adjustments of add some additional revenue that you think you might get from whatever new products or things you can do together, subtract some expenses that you think you'll no longer need to bear on a combined basis, and that's kind of your product. And then there's more one-time adjustments, which are generally less consequential to valuation, but ultimately matter to the companies in terms of cash position, financing costs, and making a transaction happen, which is just some of the friction costs of doing a deal, which is helping to keep folks like me employed, which is paying your investment bankers, paying the other advisors in the deal, so the lawyers, the accountants, all of the people, the integration consultants, et cetera, who help actually make things work and go together, and all of the various other, whether it's financing costs or things you need to do to get the transaction done. And so that kind of at a high level is how you go about a merger, and ultimately the merger model and the consequences of the merger model.
But I got staffed on this transaction that was essentially like an acquisition of like a portfolio of credit card receivables by like a newly founded entity. We're then selling the equity and the debt in that portfolio acquisition to sponsors. So literally we were doing like a buy side and a sell side at the same time. And that was crazy. And so we worked with a ton of different private equity buyers. There's just so many different moving pieces that it just made for a really, really interesting project for someone that was still learning even just the basics. But from a learning standpoint, I think a lot of it is just asking questions. So, for this particular transaction, I had to do an asset cash flow model. So like the actual cash flows of the receivables. And then I also had to do like an operating company model. So like for the company that was then going to manage the receivables portfolio and like add a bunch of different extra features and stuff, I had to do a model for that as well. And those are two very different ways to approach valuation. The sponsors leaned on the bank pretty heavily to build the model. And so like I would call them up and I would, particularly like the analyst or the associate at the sponsor. So I would call them up and be like, hey, like, you're asking me to put together this, have like these 10 clarifying questions, just want to make sure I'm approaching it correctly. Would rely on like the other people in my group that had maybe worked on similar things before, would try to find like precedent items that like I could then reference when I was building my own. And so a lot of it was just like triaging the resources all around me. And then in terms of moving the needle, like I tried to just be thoughtful. So I think part of the nice thing about making sure you're learning things well is that you're being extra thoughtful about what's going into the model. And so when you're giving it that extra layer of thought, asking why, all those types of things, it gives you the ability to add value in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you were just kind of doing your job, right? And so a lot of it was that I would say, like, I also agitated to be on calls and stuff. So like, I was always like, hey, like I'm here, if I saw my VP like taking a call in his office, I'd be like, oh, hey, what's up? Like, can I jump in on the call? And I think the more of that broader context that you have, and again, you have to make sure you're not doing that in an obnoxious way, but like the more broader context that you have, the more you can step up and take on additional responsibility. So by the end, I was like running a lot of the diligence calls. I was running a lot of the calls with like the sponsors, you know, and so it just, I had a fair amount of leeway that I think because I was so proactive at raising my hand, I don't think I would have gotten that otherwise. Making sure that you understand the figures that are coming to you in the process of putting together the sim and the teaser. So the biggest mistake that I've seen is like you get numbers from the company and you just like throw them into a table and then you send the table to your like, you know, associate or VP or whatever. And the VP is like, well, like, what does this table mean? You should be able to answer that question immediately. And if it doesn't make sense, if the table doesn't like, if it's like, you know, I don't know, you're working on like a car company and like sales have been declining drastically, you know, why, right? You want to understand things like that and be able to unpack that first layer critically before you escalate things up the chain. So I think it's just that, so that interpersonal management, and then also just like making sure that you're identifying the relevant questions well and getting ahead of that before they escalate up the chain. Those are sort of the two primary things in putting this.
Walk us through like a failure you
for
had.
This one, make it a challenge that seems real. So it kind of follows the weakness vein. Like, when have you really failed in life, and when did you really feel bad about something, and like how did you handle it, or how did you not handle it, and in hindsight you're like, wow, I really should have been more resilient in that case. And I think, like, again, strive for introspection and honesty in a question like that.
Early on, making sure you like know for sure what you don't know. Like, don't pretend you know and try to fake your way through it. It never works, because the person who's going to look at your work does know and will know immediately that you just made it up. So, so don't do that. If you don't feel like you know what you're doing, don't be afraid to ask questions, but always try to solve it first. I think the best analysts tend to be very intellectually curious and spend time solving the question for themselves before they go to other people. And then that way they can ask 2 informed questions and get the right answer instead of 10. I always felt like it was most helpful to like go back to like first principles with stuff. So like when I was confused or something sounded really complicated the way someone described it, just try to like break it down to like the most simple things that I could think of. Okay, in reality, this is what should be happening. And maybe it's only 2 or 3 simple steps, whatever that might be. And to get there, you have to then do a bunch of crazy like Excel gymnastics maybe. But at the end of the day, if like the result doesn't look like that, then you probably did something wrong. And then as you get more senior, trying to think about what the end product is supposed to look like that you're going to give the client. Like, guys like learn, and girls learn how to do Excel super well right off the jump. And then they're like, oh, look at all these crazy formulas I can use. And then it's unauditable and it got the wrong answer. And so you've wasted a bunch of your time and then you're there again till 4 in the morning or something. So, you know, try to think about where you're going before you start, you know, running the race, so to speak. Yeah, I would say that like it never is fun to tell someone like, hey, this thing that we just got an email about that like now all the MDs are super pissed about, like that was totally my fault. Everyone knows it's your fault because it was in the model anyway. So like just go to whoever you're working with, just be like, hey guys, this was on me. I'm sorry, I didn't catch this. People are going to be understanding. And I think it shows that you have integrity and character that people appreciate. And if you're willing to say like, I think I screwed this up, and be proactive about it, I think so it all starts with like, you know, client wants to do a deal, whatever it might be, you know, how do you put together, you know, pitch materials to help them understand, you know, what the outcome of that would be if they work with you. I would say the main takeaway from that is that you need to be realistic but commercial. Like